Hey everyone, tonight we're drifting back once again to that cold April in 1912, to a ship that was supposed to be the pinnacle of human achievement and ended up being something far more ordinary and human. A place where hope and class collided quietly in the dark. Settle in, pull the blankets a little higher, maybe keep just one small lamp on if you need it. We're going to spend some slow, gentle time with the third-class passengers of the RMS Titanic. Not the glittering names from the newspapers, not the champagne and orchestra crowd up on the boat deck, but the people tucked away below the waterline, the ones who paid the least and, in the end, lost the most. Let the words roll out soft and steady, like the low hum of those engines before everything changed. No rush, just a long, calm drift through what their world really looked like. The Titanic left Southampton on the 10th of April, a Wednesday, and right from the start the third-class experience was shaped by something very simple and very old: money. Or rather, the lack of it. A third-class ticket cost between £7 and £40, depending on whether you boarded in England, Ireland, or one of the continental ports. That was months of wages for most of the people who bought them. They were farmers leaving rocky Irish hillsides, textile workers from Swedish villages, seamstresses from Finnish towns, shop assistants from English mill districts, small merchants fleeing unrest in the Levant or the Russian Empire. Whole families sometimes pooled everything they had to buy one set of tickets. Single men and women traveled alone or in loose groups from the same village, hoping to find work in Pittsburgh steel mills, Minnesota farms, or New York garment factories. The dream was almost always the same: a better life, a chance to send money home, maybe bring the rest of the family over later. And for a few days at least, the ship made that dream feel almost tangible. Boarding itself was a small ordeal designed to remind everyone exactly where they stood. First and second-class passengers walked up the gangways with porters carrying their trunks, straight into warm lounges and grand staircases. Third class had to line up on the quayside or in the immigration sheds for medical inspection. Doctors in crisp white coats checked eyes, throats, scalps, looking for trachoma, lice, tuberculosis, anything that might get you turned away at Ellis Island. The United States had tightened its immigration rules in the previous decade. No one wanted to spend the crossing only to be sent straight back. So you stood there, children tugging at skirts, suitcases at your feet, while a stranger shone a light in your face and decided whether your future was still possible. If you passed, you were waved aboard and directed down narrow companionways to the lower decks. The third-class cabins were spread mostly across E, F, and G decks, with some overflow on D. Single men were housed forward, near the bow. Single women and families were placed aft. The idea was to keep the sexes separated as much as possible. Victorian morality still lingered, even on a supposedly modern liner. Cabins slept anywhere from 2 to 10 people. Most were 4 or 6 berth, with narrow iron bunks stacked 2 or 3 high. Mattresses were thin, filled with horsehair or sometimes just straw ticking over a wire spring. Blankets were provided, plain wool for the men, a bit brighter red and white checked ones for the women and children. Each berth had a small reading lamp, which was actually quite progressive for the time. There was a washstand in most rooms, with a porcelain basin, a jug of hot water brought by the steward twice a day, soap, and a towel. A small mirror hung above the basin. Hooks lined the bulkheads instead of wardrobes. You hung your coat or dress there and hoped it didn't swing too much when the ship rolled. Some cabins had a porthole. Others relied on ventilation shafts. The air was supposed to be changed regularly, but anyone who has ever slept near an engine room knows how well that promise held up. Noise was constant. The propellers thrummed through the hull plates. Water sloshed in the bilges below. Footsteps echoed in the corridors outside. If you were forward, near the bow, you felt every pitch of the ship more sharply. If you were aft, the vibration from the triple expansion engines rattled the toothbrushes in their holders. Yet for many passengers this was still better than home. A young Finnish woman named Anna Sophia Turha later remembered that her cabin felt almost luxurious compared to the one-room cottage she had left behind. There was electric light, real bulbs, not oil lamps. There was hot water on tap in the communal washrooms. There were even flush toilets, a novelty for people who had grown up with outdoor privies. Small comforts, but they mattered. The food was one of the things the White Star Line actually took pride in advertising. Third-class passengers received 3 full meals a day, plus tea and coffee at set times, and light snacks were available between. Breakfast typically included oatmeal porridge with milk and sugar, grilled herring or bacon, fried or boiled potatoes, bread, butter, marmalade, and tea or coffee. Lunch was usually a soup, split pea, vegetable, or rice, followed by roast or boiled meat, beef, mutton, pork, potatoes, cabbage or peas, bread, and a pudding or fruit pie. Dinner repeated the pattern, perhaps with a different cut of meat or a fish course, and often ended with cheese and biscuits. Portions were generous. The line didn't want anyone complaining they were hungry. The dining saloons were plain but bright, white-painted paneling, linoleum floors, long tables with benches bolted to the deck so they wouldn't slide in rough weather. There were 2 main saloons, one amidships for the forward passengers, one aft for those housed near the stern. Stewards in white jackets served the food from tureens and platters, clearing plates afterward. It wasn't elegant, but it was regular, warm, and free from the worry of having to cook it yourself. Social life happened in a handful of public rooms. The third-class general room was the main gathering place, a large, open space with settees, small tables, and a piano. Passengers played cards, wrote letters, sang songs, or simply sat and talked. The smoking room for men was smaller, paneled in dark wood, with spittoons and a bar that sold beer, stout, and ginger ale. Women and families stayed in the general room or walked the open decks. The third-class open-air spaces were limited. The well-deck forward, a sort of sheltered pit between the forward superstructure and the raised FOC celly, and the poop deck aft. Both were exposed to wind and spray, but they offered fresh air and a view of the sea. On fine days, people strolled there. Children ran about. Young men kicked a football or played quoits. Someone usually had an accordion or a fiddle. Music drifted up from below decks. Eugene Daly, a 29-year-old from Athlone, Ireland, brought his uilleann pipes and played traditional tunes on the poop deck, drawing small crowds who clapped along or sang in Gaelic. It was one of the few moments when the barriers of language and origin seemed to thin. Yet the ship's design never let anyone forget the hierarchy. Iron gates separated third class from second class, and second from first. These were not prison bars. They were lattice swing gates, but they were kept locked during the voyage except when stewards needed to pass through. The official reason was American immigration law. Steerage passengers were considered potential carriers of disease, so they were not supposed to mingle with the upper classes. In practice, it meant that third-class passengers could not wander the promenade decks, could not peek into the reading and writing room, could not glimpse the Turkish baths, or the gymnasium, or the a la carte restaurant. Their world ended at the barriers. If a curious child or a bold young man tried to slip through, a steward would appear, polite but firm, and guide them back. Some passengers later said they never even tried. Others said they peeked when no one was looking and came away astonished at how different everything looked up there. The days passed in a gentle rhythm. Mornings began with the steward knocking on cabin doors, calling breakfast in half an hour. People dressed, simple wool dresses for the women, heavy suits or work clothes for the men, then filed to the dining saloon. After breakfast, there was time to walk the deck, read, write postcards, though none would ever be posted, or simply sit and watch the horizon. Lunch at 1, tea at 4, dinner at 6 or 7. Evenings were for conversation, music, or early bed. Children played tag in the corridors until scolded. Older passengers told stories of home or speculated about America. The weather was mostly clear and cold. The North Atlantic in April is rarely kind, but the first few days were calm enough that seasickness was limited to a few sensitive souls who stayed in their bunks. Among the passengers were small clusters from the same towns or regions, and these groups became little communities within the larger one. 14 people from the tiny County Mayo village of Addergall had pooled resources to travel together. 6 survived. A group of Lebanese Christians from Hardin and nearby villages traveled as extended families. Many of the women and children would make it, but the men fared worse. Swedish and Finnish contingents stuck close, speaking their own languages, sharing food they had brought from home: dried fish, hard bread, lingonberry jam. The Irish passengers were especially noticeable. They sang, they laughed loudly, they prayed together in small knots when the mood turned reflective. One young Irish woman, 21-year-old Katie Gilnack from Clonsilla, later remembered how the third-class general room felt like a village hall on a Sunday evening. Warm, crowded, full of familiar accents, even if the faces were new. And then there were the individuals whose stories have drifted down to us in fragments. Daniel Buckley, a 21-year-old farm laborer from King Williamstown, County Cork, shared a cabin forward with 5 other young Irishmen. He was quiet, practical, the sort who kept his head down and his belongings tidy. Emily Badman, 18, from Plymouth, was traveling with friends to join family in the United States. She wrote cheerful letters home, describing the ship as a floating hotel. Sarah Roth, 26, from London, was engaged to a man already in New York. She had delayed her wedding to sail on the newest, safest ship afloat. Rhoda Abbott, 44, from Providence, Rhode Island, but originally English, was traveling with her 2 teenage sons, Roger and Eugene. She was a Salvation Army worker, devout, determined to start over after a difficult marriage. Ola Sabelseth, a 36-year-old Norwegian sheep farmer heading to South Dakota, traveled with cousins and a brother-in-law. He was tall, steady, used to hard work and cold weather. These were not dramatic figures. They were ordinary. They carried small suitcases or canvas bags containing a change of clothes, a photograph or 2, perhaps a Bible or a rosary, a few coins sewn into a hem for safety. They had little jewelry, no furs, no silver flasks. Their dreams were modest: steady work, a rented room, eventually a small house, children who would speak English without an accent. And for 4 days the ship carried those dreams steadily westward at 21 knots, slicing through the dark water under a sky full of stars. Of course, the irony is thick enough to cut with a dull knife. The Titanic was billed as practically unsinkable. Double bottoms, 15 watertight compartments, enough lifeboats for, well, not everyone, but enough to satisfy the outdated regulations of 1894. The White Star Line never quite said unsinkable, but the newspapers did, and the passengers repeated it. Down in third class, most believed it. Why wouldn't they? The ship felt enormous, solid, modern. The engines never missed a beat. The food kept coming. The lights stayed on. It was easy to imagine stepping off in New York in a few days, blinking at the tall buildings, breathing different air. But the Atlantic is patient. It waits. And on the night of Sunday, April 14th, as most of third class settled into their bunks after a plain but satisfying Sunday dinner, roast beef, gravy, peas, potatoes, plum pudding, the bird was already drifting south on its own slow current. Up on the bridge, they had received ice warnings all day. Down below, no one knew. The hum of the engines continued. The ship rolled gently. People dozed. We'll stay right here for now, in that deceptive calm, letting the hours stretch out before the first shudder. There's no hurry. The story has time. Hey everyone, we're still floating gently here, aren't we? The ship's engines are steady, The Atlantic is behaving itself for now, and down in third class the rhythm of shipboard life has settled in like an old habit. Let's keep drifting through those last quiet days and into the first faint cracks of what's coming. No need to hurry. We have time to notice the small things, the way the light slants through the ventilation grills, the faint smell of cold dust that never quite leaves the corridors, the soft clink of teacups in the dining saloon. Breathe slow. Let it all wash over you like a low, rolling swell. By Thursday and Friday, the novelty had worn off just enough for routine to take hold. Passengers woke to the same steward's knock, the same call of breakfast in half an hour, please. They shuffled into wool stockings and heavy skirts or trousers, splashed cold water on their faces from the jug the steward had left, combed hair with shared combs, and made their way to the dining saloon. The food never varied much, but no one minded. Consistency was a luxury in itself. Oatmeal one morning, perhaps with a spoonful of treacle if you asked nicely. Grilled kippers the next, their smoky salt cutting through the blandness of boiled potatoes. Bread was always there, dense, white, sliced thick, and the butter came in little pats wrapped in greaseproof paper. Children licked marmalade from their fingers while mothers wiped chins and reminded them to sit still. The long tables filled steadily, benches creaking under the weight of bodies. Conversations overlapped in a dozen languages. Rapid Finnish, lilting Irish, the guttural consonants of Swedish and Norwegian, the softer Arabic of the Lebanese families. Stewards moved between the tables with large enamel teapots, refilling cups without much ceremony. It was noisy in a comfortable way, the sound of people eating and talking and planning the rest of their lives. After breakfast, many headed up to the open decks. The well deck forward was the smaller of the two third-class promenades, a deep, sheltered space between the raised forecastle and the forward superstructure. Wind whistled across it, but the high steel bulwarks kept most of the spray out. People walked in slow circuits, arms linked, children skipping ahead or clinging to skirts. Older men leaned on the rails and smoked pipes, watching the water rush past at 21 knots. Women gathered in small knots, comparing notes on seasickness remedies or sharing photographs of relatives already in America. The poop deck aft was larger and more open, exposed to the full sweep of the wind. It had a bit more room for games, quoits, shuffleboard when the crew set up the rings, and someone usually produced an instrument. Eugene Daly's Uillean pipes appeared most afternoons. The reedy, mournful sound carried surprisingly far across the water. People gathered to listen, some tapping feet, others simply closing their eyes and letting the music remind them of home. A young Swedish girl named Ellen Hakkarainen later remembered standing at the rail with her new husband Pekko, both of them quiet, both of them thinking the same thing. This is it. We're really doing it. The general room stayed busy through the day. It was a plain space, white-painted steel walls, linoleum floor, wooden benches, and small tables screwed down tight. A single upright piano stood against one bulkhead. Anyone who could play was welcome to try, and plenty did. Someone would start, when Irish eyes are smiling, and half the room would join in, voices rising and falling in different keys, but all in the same key of hope. Others played cards, whist, patience, poker with matches for stakes. Letters were written on cheap notepaper bought from the ship's writing room. Third class had limited access to stationery, but enough to send a few lines home when they reached New York. Children drew pictures with borrowed pencils. The room smelled of piped tobacco, damp wool, warm bodies, and the faint metallic tang of the ship itself. It wasn't luxurious, but it was communal, and for people who had spent years in isolated villages or crowded tenements, that counted for a great deal. Yet the ship never let anyone forget the invisible walls. The iron gates between third and second class were always there, simple swing barriers with latticework that let you see through, but not pass. Stewards patrolled them casually, nodding to familiar faces but never stepping aside for long. A curious teenage boy might press his face to the bars and catch a glimpse of second-class passengers in better coats strolling past. He'd stare until a steward tapped his shoulder and said, "Back to your own deck, lad." No one was ever rough about it, but the message was clear. Up on the boat deck, first-class promenades stretched wide and empty under the stars. Turkish baths steamed behind frosted glass. The gymnasium offered mechanical horses and rowing machines. The a la carte restaurant served 12-course dinners with vintage wines. None of it was visible from below, but word traveled. A steward might mention it in passing, or a second-class passenger might lean over the barrier during a rare moment when the gate was open and describe the palm court or the squash court. The stories grew in the telling. Up there everything was silk and polish. Down here everything was sturdy and plain. And sturdy and plain was fine, until it wasn't. That evening the third-class dining saloons filled early. Sunday dinner was always a little better. Roast sirloin of beef with Yorkshire pudding, horseradish sauce, peas, carrots, boiled potatoes, gravy thick enough to stand spoon in. For dessert there was plum duff with custard or apple tart. People lingered over their plates, talking about what they would do first when they landed. Daniel Buckley in his cabin, mates joked about finding the biggest steak in New York and eating until they couldn't move. Emily Badman wrote a quick note to her mother describing how kind the stewards had been and how the food was better than expected. Sarah Roth sat with friends, laughing softly, already imagining her wedding dress waiting in a New York wardrobe. Rhoda Abbott read a psalm to her boys, her voice low and steady, reminding them that God had brought them this far and would see them the rest of the way. After dinner, the general room filled again. Someone started hymns, "Nearer, my God, to thee abide with me." The piano accompaniment was hesitant but earnest. People joined in, some in English, some in their own languages, the melodies overlapping in a gentle discord. Others drifted back to cabins early. The engines kept their steady beat. Lights were dimmed in the public rooms around 10. Stewards made their last rounds, checking that portholes were closed against the cold, refilling water jugs, saying good night in half a dozen accents. Most of third class was asleep by 11. Children curled against mothers. Husbands and wives lay close in narrow bunks. Single men snored in rows. The ship rolled gently, a cradle motion that had lulled thousands of immigrants before them. The temperature outside hovered just above freezing. Stars were sharp overhead. The Berg was out there somewhere, drifting south on the Labrador Current, its bulk mostly hidden below the surface. At 11:40 p.m., the lookouts in the crow's nest saw it, a black shape against the starlit water, too late to turn sharply. The order came down, hard a starboard, engines full astern. The wheel spun. The ship began to swing, slowly, ponderously. Then the grinding began. Not a crash, not a thunderclap, just a long, low scrape along the starboard side, like 1,000 knives drawn slowly across steel. Ice cracked and tinkled against the hull. The Berg brushed past, shedding chunks into the well deck, then vanished into the dark again. Down below, most people slept through it. Daniel Buckley fell to first. He was in berth number 324 on E-deck forward, near the bow. The ship gave a slight shudder, then a long, scraping rasp that vibrated through the mattress and into his spine. Water pattered onto the floor, first a drip, then a thin stream. He sat up, confused. One of his cabin mates muttered, "What the hell was that?" Buckley swung his legs over the bunk edge and stepped into cold water that covered his ankles. He swore quietly, grabbed his boots, and woke the others. "Get up. Something's wrong." Further aft, in the women's quarters, Emily Badman stirred. The scrape was fainter back there, more of a distant rumble. She opened her eyes, listened. The engines had stopped. That was what registered first, the silence where the thrum should have been. She sat up, reached for her dressing gown. A friend in the next bunk whispered, "Did you feel that?" Emily nodded. They listened together. Somewhere forward, voices were rising. By 12:15, the first white rockets burst overhead, bright magnesium flares that lit the faces below in stark white and shadow. People on the poop deck looked up, watched the stars disappear behind smoke, then reappear. A low murmur ran through the crowd. Someone said, "That's distress." Someone else said, "They'll come for us. There's another ship close." The Carpathia was 58 miles away, steaming hard. But 58 miles is a long way on a freezing night. Let's pause here. In the half hour after the collision, when confusion was still soft around the edges and hope hadn't quite curdled yet. The engines were silent. The ship was settling, almost imperceptibly, by the head. And down in third class the slow, reluctant awakening was just beginning. "Hey everyone, we're still here together in the quiet dark, aren't we?" The rockets have just begun bursting overhead, white stars blooming and fading against the black, and down below the third-class corridors are starting to feel a little narrower, a little colder. Let's keep drifting through this hour, the one that stretches longest in the memory, without rushing. No need to leap ahead. We'll walk it step by slow step, the way most of those passengers did. Uncertain, coat thrown over night clothes, children's hands gripped tight, voices low because no one quite wants to admit out loud that this might be serious. Breathe easy. Let the words settle like frost on the railings. By 12:20, the first real signs of trouble had reached the lower decks, though not in any orderly announcement. Stewards moved through the forward corridors first, knocking on cabin doors with the same calm tone they'd used to call breakfast. "Lifebelts, please. Just as a precaution. Up to the boat deck when you're ready." Some doors opened at once. Sleepy faces peered out, blinking. Others stayed closed a little longer, people hoping it was nothing, or perhaps not hearing the knock over the sudden, unnatural silence where the engines used to be. Water was already ankle-deep in the very forward third-class berths on G-deck. It came in cold and black, smelling faintly of oil and iron. Mattresses floated off their frames. Suitcases bobbed against bulkheads. A few passengers tried to salvage what they could, grabbing photographs, money belts, a child's favorite doll, before wading toward the companionways. Daniel Buckley and his 5 cabin mates were among the first groups moving aft. They dressed quickly, boots unlaced, coats half-buttoned, then joined the growing file of people in the corridor. The deck had a slight but unmistakable tilt now. Bow down. You felt it in your balance, the way you had to lean forward just a fraction to walk straight. Buckley later said the water in their cabin had reached his knees by the time they left. They didn't bother closing the door behind them. Up one ladder, along a white-painted passageway, past other cabins where stewards were still rousing stragglers. A woman in a shawl carried a toddler on her hip. The child was crying softly, more from confusion than fear. An older man helped his wife tie her lifebelt, fingers fumbling with the tapes. No one shouted. The only raised voices belonged to stewards repeating instructions in English, then gesturing when the words didn't land. Further aft, the impact had been softer, almost unnoticeable. Emily Badman and her small group of friends from Plymouth had felt little more than a long, grinding shudder before the engine stopped. They'd waited a few minutes in their cabin, listening, then stepped into the corridor just as the first steward appeared. "Best get your lifebelts on, ladies. Up the stairs, please." They obeyed without argument. Emily pulled a heavy coat over her nightdress, pinned her hair back out of habit, slipped on shoes. One friend grabbed a small handbag with her ticket and a few pounds. Another took nothing but the lifebelt slung over her arm. They climbed the companionway together, narrow iron stairs with rubber treads, joining a slow-moving line of passengers. The air grew colder with every step upward. Breath showed in faint clouds. Someone ahead muttered, "They'll have another ship here soon." They always do. In the women's quarters aft, Ellen Hakkarainen woke her husband Pekko with a gentle shake. The scrape had been distant, almost dreamlike, but the silence afterward felt wrong. Pecco dressed first, went out to investigate, came back pale but calm. "There's water forward. They're saying life belts." Ellen pulled on stockings, a wool skirt, her heaviest sweater. Pecco helped her into the life belt, awkward canvas and cork that smelled faintly of new rope, then tied his own. They left their small suitcase behind without a second thought. In the corridor, they met other Finnish couples, speaking in low, rapid sentences. No one knew quite what to do, so they followed the stream of people heading up. Children were carried or led by the hand. A little boy of 5 or 6 clutched a wooden toy boat. It would float away later, unnoticed. Rhoda Abbott woke her 2 teenage sons at almost the same moment. Roger, 16, and Eugene, 13, were already half awake from the odd motion. She spoke quietly, the way she always did when things were difficult. "Boys, we need to go up. Life belts first." They dressed in silence, trousers, jackets, caps, then helped each other with the bulky belts. Rhoda's hands were steady, but her eyes kept scanning their faces. She had crossed the Atlantic before, under worse circumstances. She knew how quickly calm could turn. They left their cabin aft and joined the upward flow. Rhoda kept one son on each side, a hand on each shoulder. "Stay close," she said again and again, though the boys were already taller than she was. By 12:45, the boat deck was beginning to fill, though not yet crowded. First and second-class passengers arrived in fur coats and evening dress, some still laughing nervously, others quiet. Third class came up more slowly. The stairways were narrower, the paths longer, the gates between classes had to be opened one at a time. Some stewards held the barriers wide and waved groups through. Others waited for orders and let people bunch up below. Confusion rippled downward. A Lebanese family, the Nakeds, husband, wife, and their 2-year-old daughter, reached a closed gate on E deck. The steward there hesitated, then unlocked it after a moment's glance at the child. They hurried through, joining the line for the boat deck. Further back, others weren't so fortunate. A knot of single men pressed against a lattice gate while a steward repeated, "Women and children first. Wait here, please." The men waited, shifting from foot to foot, watching women and small groups pass. Olis Abelseth had gone up early with his cousins and brother-in-law. They reached the boat deck just after midnight, life belts on, and stood near the starboard rail watching the first boats being uncovered. Officers moved with practiced calm, collapsing the canvas covers, swinging the davits out, hooking the falls. No one seemed in a hurry. Abelseth later said the ship still looked perfectly sound, lights blazing from every porthole, the 4 funnels stark against the sky. A few chunks of ice still lay on the forward well deck below, sparkling under the floodlights. Someone nearby joked, "We'll be laughing about this in New York." No one laughed back. The first lifeboat, number 7 on the starboard side, swung out at 12:45 and began loading almost at once. Women and children from first and second class stepped forward. A few third-class women and children were guided to the boats as well, but the majority of third-class passengers were still arriving on deck or waiting on the stair landings below. Eugene Daly helped several women in a boat 13 on the port side, then stepped back when an officer waved him away. Men later, the officer said. Daly nodded and moved to help others. He would stay on deck until almost the end. By 1 o'clock, the tilt was unmistakable. You could feel it when you walked, a gentle but persistent lean toward the bow. Glasses slid along tables in the smoking room. Trunks shifted in baggage compartments. In the third-class general room below, abandoned teacups rolled across the floor and shattered against the piano leg. Water was now lapping at the base of the forward grand staircase on D deck, still far from third class, but closing the distance deck by deck. The forward cargo holds were nearly full. The mail room was submerged to the ceiling. Pumps thundered somewhere deep in the ship, but the sound was muffled, futile. Passengers on the boat deck began to notice the angle more clearly. A child pointed and asked why the sea looked higher on one side. A mother hushed him quickly. Someone else said, "She's settling by the head. They'll pump her out." But the rockets kept going up. Every few minutes another white flare, another puff of smoke. The nearest ship, the Californian, was stopped in the ice field, her masthead lights visible low on the horizon. Too far to reach in time. Carpathia was coming, but still hours away. Emily Badman reached the boat deck around 1:15. She and her friend stood near collapsible D, watching boat after boat lower away half full. Officers called for women and children. Stewards helped them step over the gap between deck and boat. Emily hesitated. She saw no sign of panic, only quiet order, so she waited. A steward finally took her arm. "In you go, miss." She stepped into boat 13, sat on a hard thwart, pulled her coat tighter. The boat jerked downward in fits and starts. When it reached the water, the falls were cast off. Oars dipped, pulling them away from the towering black side of the ship. Lights still blazed from every porthole. The band was playing somewhere above, ragtime at first, then slower melodies. Emily looked back and saw the ship still seemed almost level, only the slight downward tilt of the bow betraying anything wrong. Sarah Roth boarded Collapsible C a little later. She had waited on the port side with friends, watching the slow procession of boats. When her turn came, she stepped in without looking back. The boat was crowded, mostly women and children, a few men who had slipped aboard in the confusion. They rowed away in the dark, the cold biting through coats and gloves. Back on deck, the third-class men who had helped women and children now stood in larger groups, hands in pockets, breath fogging. Some smoked. Some prayed quietly. Ollis Abelseth and his relatives stayed together near the stern. They watched boat after boat pull away. An officer approached once, asked if there were any more women or children. Abelseth shook his head. The officer moved on. Abelseth later said he never felt real fear. Not then. Just a deep, cold certainty that things were ending. By 1:45, the bow was noticeably down. Water reached the base of the forward funnel. The ship's lights still burned bright, but the angle made them look strange, tilted forward like lanterns on a sinking house. People on the poop deck felt the stern rise beneath their feet. Children clung to railings. Parents spoke softly, promising everything would be all right. The band moved to the boat deck now, playing Autumn, or perhaps nearer, My God, to Thee. Accounts differ, but the music was gentle, steady, almost soothing in its refusal to hurry. Rhoda Abbott stood near Collapsible A with her boys. They had waited patiently, watching other women board. When the call came again, women and children. She stepped forward with Roger and Eugene close behind. An officer blocked the boys. "They're too old," Rhoda argued quietly, desperately. The officer shook his head. She kissed her sons, told them to be brave, then climbed in. The boat was lowered away. She looked up, saw their faces against the lights, then lost them in the dark. The tilt steepened. Trunks slid across cabin floors far below. Furniture shifted. A low groan came from somewhere deep in the hull. Plates straining, rivets popping one by one. Water poured through open portholes now, flooding corridors in black torrents. The last third-class passengers still below were climbing higher, hand over hand, up companionways that grew steeper with every minute. Let's linger here a moment longer, in the hour when hope hadn't quite died but was thinning fast. The sea lapped closer. The stars stayed bright. The rockets kept falling, unanswered. Hey everyone, we've come a long way together through this long, slow night. The rockets have mostly stopped now. The last few boats are pulling away into the dark, and the ship's bow is sinking deeper with every passing minute. Let's stay right here with the third-class passengers in these final moments. No rush, no drama, just a gentle, inevitable tilt and the soft sounds that come with it. The band is still playing somewhere up on the boat deck, the notes drifting down like they're trying to keep everything calm even as the water rises. Breathe slow. Let the cold settle in your mind the way it settled over them. By 2 o'clock the angle had grown steep enough that walking felt strange. You had to lean back slightly to stay upright, like moving against a slow, invisible current. On the poop deck, the highest open space still above water, third-class passengers crowded together in the stern. The forward well deck was already awash. Water lapped over the base of the forward funnel. Lights still burned in every porthole, throwing long golden rectangles across the Black Sea. But the ship's trim made them slant forward oddly, like lanterns hung crooked on a wall. People stood in small groups, arms linked, coats pulled tight. Children were quieter now, too cold or too tired to cry. Parents spoke in low voices, promising things they could no longer be sure of. Oldest Abel Seth and his relatives stayed near the starboard rail on the poop deck. They had watched the last of the regular lifeboats swing out and lower away, most of them half empty, some with only a handful of women and children aboard. An officer had come by once more, asking if there were any women or children left. Abel Seth shook his head. The officer nodded and moved on without another word. Abel Seth later remembered the moment clearly. No panic, no anger, just a deep, quiet understanding that the boats were gone and the sea was coming. He and his cousins tied their life belts tighter, helped each other check the tapes, then waited. The stern kept rising beneath their feet. The deck sloped like a rooftop now. Someone started singing a hymn in Norwegian. A few voices joined in, soft and unsteady. Daniel Buckley had made it a boat 13 earlier, squeezed in among women and children when a gap opened in the line. He sat on a thwart, oars in hand, pulling away from the ship's side. Looking back, he saw the lights still blazing, the 4 funnels standing tall against the sky. The tilt was obvious even from the water. The bow was low, the stern high. Buckley rowed until his arms ached, then wrapped himself in a blanket someone passed forward. The cold was bone deep already. He kept glancing back at the ship, watching it settle lower, watching the lights stay on. Emily Badman was in the same boat. She sat near the bow, coat collar turned up, hands tucked into sleeves. The oars dipped and rose in uneven rhythm. Someone in the boat began to pray aloud. Others joined in fragments. Emily looked back once, saw the ship still lit from stem to stern, still beautiful in a terrible way. Then she turned forward and stared into the dark, trying not to think about the people still on board. Sarah Roth had boarded Collapsible C on the port side. The boat was crowded, mostly women, a few men who had helped load it, and then slipped in when no one was looking. They rowed away slowly, the cold wind cutting through every layer. Roth wrapped her arms around herself and watched the ship recede. The band was playing something slow and familiar. She couldn't quite place it. Later she would say the music sounded like it was coming from very far away, like a memory rather than something happening right then. Rhoda Abbott had been separated from her sons at Collapsible A. She sat in the half-flooded boat, knees drawn up, staring back at the rising stern. Roger and Eugene had stayed on deck, too old to be considered children, too young to be given a place without argument. She had kissed them both, told them to find each other and jump when the time came. Now she could only watch. The cold numbed her legs first, then crept upward. She prayed silently, over and over, the same few words. Ellen Hakkarainen had lost Pekko somewhere in the confusion below. She had waited for him on the boat deck as long as she could, then been guided into a lifeboat by a steward who said, "He'll follow, miss. Get in." The boat pulled away. She kept looking back, calling his name into the wind until her voice cracked. Pekko never appeared. She wrapped herself in a blanket and sat shivering, eyes fixed on the ship's lights. Eugene Daly had stayed on deck until nearly the end. He helped load Collapsible B, then stepped back when the officer, said no more men. As the stern rose higher, he moved aft with a group of other third-class men. They climbed onto the upturned hull of the collapsible when it floated free, balancing on the wet wood, clinging to the gunwales. The water was close now, black and oily, flecked with ice. Daly later said he heard the band stop abruptly, then a long, deep groan from inside the ship as bulkheads gave way. Around 2:15, the forward funnel collapsed with a thunderous crash, sending sparks and soot high into the air. The sound rolled across the water like distant artillery. Boats rocked in the swell it created. People in the water screamed, hundreds of voices rising at once, then falling away as the cold took them. The remaining third-class passengers on the poop deck slid forward along the sloping deck, grabbing at railings, at each other. Some jumped early, lifebelts bright against the black sea. Others waited until the last possible moment. At 2:20 the lights flickered once, twice, then went out for good. A second of total darkness, then the emergency dynamos kicked in and the boat deck lights came back on, dimmer, reddish. The ship broke somewhere between the third and fourth funnels, a low, grinding snap that carried across the water. The bow section plunged forward and down. The stern rose almost vertical, black against the stars, then settled back with a slow, terrible grace. Water rushed over the boat deck in a white wave. The last people still aboard were swept away or clung to whatever they could reach. The stern floated alone for a minute or two, lights still burning dimly, then slipped under with almost no sound, just a long sigh as air escaped through open hatches and portholes. The sea closed over it. A low boom rolled outward as the boilers imploded far below. Then silence. Real silence. No engines, no music, no voices. Only the lapping of water against drifting wreckage and the soft cries of those still alive in the sea. The lifeboats drifted apart in the dark. Some rowed back toward the cries, picking up a handful of people before the cold made it impossible. Most stayed away. Officers feared suction, though there was little. The water temperature was 20 degrees Fahrenheit. Survival time in it was measured in minutes. Hundreds floated in their life belts, faces upturned to the stars, voices growing weaker until they stopped. Carpathia arrived just before 4 in the morning. Her lights appeared first as a distant glow, then grew brighter as she steamed through the ice field. Rockets answered from her deck. Lifeboats were spotted one by one. Ropes were lowered. Exhausted passengers were hauled aboard, some weeping, some silent, most too cold to speak. Third-class survivors were given blankets, hot drinks, dry clothes from the ship's stores. Rhoda Abbott was carried below, legs frostbitten, mind numb. She asked for her boys again and again. No one could answer. By 8 o'clock the last boat was alongside. Carpathia turned for New York with 705 survivors aboard, most of them women and children from first and second class, a smaller number from third. Of the more than 700 third-class passengers, only about 174 lived. The rest, over 500, were gone. Entire families vanished. Villages in Ireland, Finland, Lebanon would wait months for letters that never came. In New York, the survivors were met by crowds, reporters, Red Cross workers. Funds were raised quickly. Immigrants with no family were helped into temporary housing, given clothes, small sums of money. Some married quickly. Sarah Roth wed her fiancé days later in a quiet ceremony. Others drifted into new lives quietly, carrying memories they rarely spoke of. Anna Terha settled in Ohio, married, raised children, but said the screams from the water followed her into dreams for years. Emily Badman returned to England eventually, lived a long life, told her story calmly when asked. Daniel Buckley worked as a farmhand, then a laborer, never quite shook the cold from his bones. Inquiries followed, Senate hearings in Washington, a British commission in London. A few third-class survivors testified, their accents thick, their English halting. They spoke of gates, of delays, of waiting below while boats left half empty. The official reports blamed outdated regulations, insufficient lifeboats, poor emergency planning. The myth of locked gates grew anyway. People needed a villain, and class made an easy one. The truth was quieter, colder. The system had never been designed with steerage in mind. When a crisis came, the lower decks were farthest from the boats, last to be informed, slowest to reach safety. The wreck lies now in two pieces on the bottom, 14,000 feet down. Rusticless bloom across the steel. The third-class general room is long gone, the piano silent, the bunks collapsed under pressure. But the stories remain, small, human, stubborn. Ordinary people who dreamed modest dreams, boarded a ship they believed would change everything, and met the sea instead. And so we drift to the end. The Atlantic is calm tonight in our minds, the way it was calm that morning after the last boat pulled away. No more rockets, no more music, just the slow roll of water over what used to be a ship. Let that image settle gently. Close your eyes if you like. Sleep will come easier now, on quieter seas. Thank you for staying with me through this long night. Rest well.